Okay, so this is part two to the how to solve the Tefilla problem. If you haven't seen that video, you can go check it out. It's the previous part. You kind of need to know what we said in that video to understand what we're going to be talking about in this video. And this video is going to be broken into really two parts. One is sort of like how to prepare to solve the problem. And then the second part is really the actual solving of the problem. And there's going to be a second video that we're going to make, which is really just going to be part three, sort of dealing with a second phase of the whole process that we have to go through in order to solve the problem of tefillah. So basically, as we sort of said in the previous video, just sort of briefly reference it so we can plan out how we're going to organize this, this part of the ideas, is that the way that you actually perceive something defines the way you experience it, relate to it emotionally, thought-wise, action-wise. And you can't really fake that. And the issue with tefillah is that essentially, in order to actually have some kind of interaction with what we call Hashem, whatever word you want to use for that, we're going to talk more about Hashem in a little while. You can't just pretend that you actually see that or that it's real if it actually isn't real for you on the inside. And what I mean by that, the reason why that's true with tefillah is because tefillah is inherently internal. It is something which is, it's not just an externality thing oriented, activity that you can just do things on the outside and that kind of like does whatever you need to get done. It's actually an internal phenomenon, in which case it kind of leads us to our first point, which is that in order to begin the process of actually doing tefillah properly, you need to approach yourself with genuine honesty. And genuine honesty is a pretty hard thing to come by when you're dealing with yourself. But it's the only way to actually create or solve the problem of just not really connecting to or experiencing or using the tool of tefillah that we're talking about here. So what I mean by genuine honesty is, you can think of it as an analogy like if you're in a relationship with somebody, so when there is a lack of honesty, it doesn't just mean like, these big monumental dishonesties where like you kind of like have something you're not telling the other person, like you're hiding things from them. That's like a very obvious problem, and usually when you have that problem, you actually know you're doing that. You have this, inner issue that you're just not really sharing, and so you feel the pressure of how I'm not speaking about that. But I'm talking about something which is actually much more prominent, pervasive. It's much more common, which is that it's where you have like a certain habit or pattern of how you interact with the other person that you're in the relationship with, and then in that habit, so you fall back on like patterns of speech and topics of conversation from a place of habit, as opposed to genuinely trying to figure out like what it is that you're thinking about and then how to sort of share that or open up about that with the other person. So it's like a kind of like a comfort zone type of habituation where you really just continuously just fall back on those patterns of thought and perspectives and ways of relating to the other person. And it's very easy to do that. It's very, it just sort of like becomes your default after like, a few times of having a relationship with somebody. Like it's sort of, you start to develop a certain, habit of language and common language. And, as an analogy, it's kind of like when you have a couple. So like when they first start off, like when they say how much they love each other, it comes from a place of like, I'm trying genuinely to take what's inside of myself and put it into the outside space so you can actually hear it. And then you can learn and hear me articulate what I feel about you. And that's very different than later on when you start having couples that they actually imitate their own past selves. In other words, they think to themselves, how did I used to say this to the person? And like, I'll just say that again, and like that will like recreate that good feeling in that moment and that situation of relationship and connection that we had when I originally said that. As opposed to, and the problem with that is that's a habituated way of saying something. In other words, it's not really you now taking what's inside of you and putting it on the outside towards the other person. You're not really being open and real and genuine with the other person. Instead, what you're doing is you're relying on the fact that they've experienced this once, and instead of being genuine, you're having them like remember themselves, or you're hoping they're going to remember, and they'll feel the same things, even though there's only like an external trigger that's kind of a reminder of this. So that habituated way of being is what I mean when I say a lack of honesty. I don't mean that you're lying. I mean, it's a tiny bit of lying if you think about it carefully. But it's not that you're lying. It's just that you're not giving into the situation what it is that you and the other person really need to create a deeper connection. And what you really need is you need to actually go inside yourself and figure out, what is it that I am thinking and feeling? Where am I genuinely right now? And I want to now put that out there so I can be who I am. That's a little bit tricky to do, because sometimes if you're with the person that you love, you might not really feel such a profound sense of like attachment or connection, or or genuine even interest. You could be bored, with the other person that day. You could have because again, the more you're with somebody, so the more the patterns of connection and distance start to kind of like oscillate and unfold. So you could have time periods where you feel very much like taking for granted the other person, where you're a little bored of the interaction, where a little bit more distance would probably be healthy to help you really kind of, become more in touch with the interest and desire and attachment for the other person. But the problem is that like you don't want to say that to the other person, because you say, well, right now I'm not so interested in talking to you or so interested in hanging out with you. So then it makes the other person feel hurt, because like, well, this person doesn't love me. So that's why people generally tend to try to avoid being genuine in situations like that. The problem with not being genuine, though, is that it leads to an accumulation of habits and barriers between two people. And so that's like a very serious trade-off there, which you have to really be aware of, that you're making that trade-off when you do those kinds of things. And we can have a separate discussion, and we will have, about how to actually manage the amount of genuineness, and as a trading off with the amount of potential hurt that it could cause the other person. And it certainly would be very useful to come into a relationship constantly pledging to be as genuine as possible, and understanding that just because right now I might not feel those types of feelings does not mean that I do not love the other person. That's a much longer discussion about what is love, and it's obviously very important, but really a side point for our purposes right now. The point is that the same exact thing is true about Hashem. In other words, if you talk, and again, we need to talk about Hashem in a second, but the first thing we're doing now is we are talking about how to remove obstacles that are inside in order to get ready to deal with the Hashem question. So that's really the first part of this discussion. So the obstacle here is that if you are not honest with yourself, in other words, if you're not trying to get in touch with what you actually genuinely think and feel and believe, and the ideas that are in your head, if you can't face them and put them in front of you and actually explore them, so then you can't deal with this problem. Because just like with another person, if you have a habituated way of interacting with them, it interferes with your genuine connection with them. With Hashem, your habituated interaction with Hashem, if you have this very childish idea that there is a guy in the sky who is watching you and taking notes and everything that you're doing, and that whenever you do something which is bad, and again, there's no definition of what defines something as bad. We all kind of just know what's bad when we really don't even really know. We just sort of think we know, and like when it starts to get complicated, then we really fall apart with this. But it's like, well, no, we all know that the things that are bad, like it's bad to kill people. Well, really, it's not always bad to kill people. There are situations where it is, situations where it isn't, and these are like complicated questions. And the question is, why is it bad to do something like that? You have to think about that also. Like, what exactly is the problem with that? And what does that say about reality? That, as a person, that you can't remove them from this place. Like, what does that say about them and like the way that you perceive them? And there's like a lot of depth underneath that. So if you're not thinking about those things, you just have a very, just like a basic perspective of like, well, there's a guy in the sky. I have to do what he says. I have to believe in him because there's something called faith. And I have to have faith that there's such a guy in the sky. So that kind of perspective is like so primitive and rudimentary that like it's just going, and again, you kind of keep thinking those thoughts from when you're 10, 20, 15, 20 years old. So like it's just going to interfere with any ability to actually figure out how to do the next part of this, which is learn about Hashem and develop yourself, because you just have this idea in your head, a bunch of ideas really, that are very fixed and that you're so used to, and you can even be used to having a situation with those types of ideas that you actually don't even believe them. Let's say you're the type of person, you say, well, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in these ideas. So then what you have now is you have ideas that are stuck in your head, which you now don't believe in, and you're like, well, I don't believe these things. I'm an atheist, therefore I shouldn't engage in Tefilla because, like, well, I don't believe in God. But it's like, well, the things you don't believe in are actually the things you're supposed to be getting rid of. So that's really just like an important point to make, just in terms of cleaning up, cleaning house, like taking care of this whole thing and how you see these things. That when I say honesty, I mean you have to be genuinely honest about whatever it is that you think. And if you don't believe that there is a guy in the sky that is watching you, but you keep saying that you do believe that because that's what people around you are saying, or that's what you're supposed to say, so then you need to be honest with yourself that you do not believe that. If you think, certain things about the way that the Torah describes Hashem, or any ideas you have about Hashem, you have to put them out there in front of yourself. You could do it with another person, you could do it, with a good friend, you could do it just by yourself by writing it out on a piece of paper. But you have to start being honest with yourself about what it is that you actually think, Because if you don't do that, so then again, these things just sit there as habits and they just get in the way. So, and the issue again with that is that, like when you're doing tefillah, because it's an internal process, only by being genuinely honest can you ever undergo the process in a real way. You don't need to. You're not fooling anybody. No one else cares. You're the one who's the one living your life. So like in terms of what goes on the outside, so people look at each other and try to evaluate what it looks like you're doing. But in terms of what goes on the inside, it's just you. Only you know about that. So if you want to try to genuinely do tefillah in any form, you got to be honest with yourself on the inside about what it is that you think. And you can figure out where you're holding, like where you're at with these things. And once you know that, then we can go to the next phase, which is let's walk from where you're at to where you can go. Like what is the pathway? Like where can we explore and what can we find when we kind of get out there a little bit? So and again, the same exact thing is true with a relationship. You got to know where you're at, so that way you can really you can be free to explore where you can go next. And if you just decide to stay where you're at and stagnate there, you'll keep saying the same fake things to the person that you're in the relationship with, and you will never get into a place of genuine upgraded connection, and it'll simply interfere with your relationship. And exactly the same thing is true with Hashem. So that's something which just is important to think about. It's phase 1 of this process. So phase 2, we're now going to talk a little bit about Hashem. And I just want to stress, this is really like a topic that we're going to have. I'm actually trying to build a website right now, which is the purpose of it is literally to explore this topic over like hours and hours and hours of content, both in terms of the core concepts and then the core descriptions, and then how they play out and manifest in so many different ways. So there's really so much to talk about. But because I want this to be a self-contained video and like mini series of these 3 videos, so we're just going to take one piece of the puzzle here, a kind of like a useful analogy and way of thinking I think will really sort of help to show you where you can go a little bit more than where you are right now. So that analogy is and in general, analogies are very useful tools to start thinking about Hashem, because the issue with Hashem, just like with another person, is that it is impossible to talk directly about Hashem. In other words, just like it's also true to say it is impossible to talk directly about another person. Now you might argue and say, what do you mean? I can talk about you all the time. Here, you did this, you do that. If you think about it carefully, you never verbalize anything about another person except things that you can measure on the outside in some form. So you want to talk about personality traits. You want to talk about the way people look in their bodies. You want to talk about actions people have done. Those are all things that if you describe me as having a certain type of personality, let's say you say that I'm, friendly, assertive, and a good listener, but sometimes a little bit too much focus on laughing, random traits, right? So that description I just said verbally could fit literally millions of people, and those are all data points. They are external things. They are ways we can measure this self. That way, if you wanted to find me, you look for like a self that is coming through a body that has those attributes, whether they're physical attributes, my height, weight, things like that, or my personality attributes, the example I just gave. If you want to get access to me, the self, so you got to find a body that has that setup, and that's then it could be that's the access point to get to me. But to talk about me, the actual self, there is no way to do that. You cannot ever verbalize or articulate a description of self, because the self is totally experiential. That's true about Hashem, and it's true about you, which is why if you ever try to set somebody up on a blind date, for example, so you'll find that you can describe the other person to them, be like, oh, they're this way, this way, this way. And then when they actually meet them, the experience of the self is like completely separate, and not separate, but different and beyond the descriptive terms that you use. So sometimes people like to talk about how we're not allowed to talk about Hashem. We can only talk about Hashem in negative terms, like things that he isn't, or we can talk about things that Hashem does. We can describe Hashem's actions, but we're not allowed to speak about Hashem. But the truth is, that's actually not at all what's going on here. It is impossible to speak about Hashem. Any attempt to do that and believing that you are actually speaking about Hashem directly about the self is inherently not true, because it is not possible to speak about that which is beyond all measurements, just like the self is intangible and experientially beyond all measurement. So too with Hashem. Hashem is beyond experientially beyond all measurement and all verbalization. So that's just an important backdrop point just to realize and think about. And so analogies are a way we can start to direct you towards how to think about Hashem on the inside experiential place inside of you that's called the das, that you can now, your ability to process or to experience anything. In other words, the sense of you experiencing reality. So we can talk about analogies that will give you an experiential sense of who we mean when we say Hashem. So I'm going to give you 1.5 analogies. So the main analogy that I want you to sort of use is, this is again just like a setting down the backdrop analogy. I want you to think about it as, imagine that you are a character in a book. So let's say Harry Potter. You're a character in the book Harry Potter. And you're in the story, and everything that's around you, your surroundings, the world that you live in, you are all characters inside of that book. And so now, when you're inside that book and you're living your life, so there's an author who is writing that book. Now, the question is, if you as a character, which direction do you need to look in for you to be looking in the direction of that author? See what I'm trying to do here? Now, I'll just mention, of course, in a book, so it's a little different from our situation because we experience ourselves as having free will. So that means that we are operating autonomously from the author's will. The author is writing a book about us, and yet we somehow are able to do things that violate the will of the author. That's a longer discussion, which we're not going to do right now. But the point is that, just in terms of the purpose of the analogy right now, is just to think for a second about where you are, and then, well, okay, I'm inside of this book, and there's an author. So which direction do you have to look in to see the author, to find the author? Where is the author exactly relative to you? And what you'll notice is that there is no direction that inside of the story that you could look towards where the author is, because the author is not in a direction relative to the book. Because if the author was, the author wouldn't be the author, because then the author would be another character in the book. Because characters in the book are relative. One is over here and one is over there. They have a little world, and inside that world there's characters, and this one is over here, this one is over there. Each one has their role inside the world. But if the author is the origin of the book, so the author cannot be in a particular direction relative to the characters, because the characters are in the book and the author is beyond the book, is in a different plane. They're not able to be related to each other in that way. So if you think about that carefully, though, at the same time that's true, it's also true to say that there is no aspect of this story that we are in which the author is not manifest. In other words, the author is the book. The author is all of these things that are in the book are simply taking place in and products of the mind, the raw material of the mind of the author. To sort of take the I said 1.5 analogies, let's just bolster that analogy with another half analogy. If you imagine inside of your head a little man, meaning relative to you, a man in your mind, and you give him a family, a wife, children, a home, and he has a job, and he has neighbors, and you imagine all of that, and you literally live out his life. And he's talking, to his friends, and they're trying to discuss, do you believe in the great, in my case, my name is Zev, so do you believe in the great Zev? He created us? I don't know, if I never really saw the great Zev, I never met Zev. And it's well, where is Zev? It's well, where exactly should those people be pointing? Which directions they need to look to find me if I am the one who is thinking about them? So where am I relative to them? The answer is the word relative does not apply to that situation, because there's no where that you could point where that would actually be applicable in the situation. There's no direction, because the mind is not a directional context that is somehow able to be they're not in here. It's not like they're inside of my mind. Now it's well, I'm over here, and they're pointing to there is nowhere inside of that space that is not me. It's all me, and yet still there's this little bubble of their being. And the same thing exactly is true with the book example, which is these are just ways to start thinking about how Hashem is much more than just a guy in the sky over there, and you have to start developing and sharpening your tools, because you have the tools to encounter Hashem. The reason why that's for sure clearly true is because once you learn more about the structure of how Hashem operates and how he interfaces with this reality, you will find that it is exactly the same as the way that you interface with this reality and other people interface with this reality, because we are exactly parallel structured to Hashem. We are endless selves that are manifest through a series of layers and tools into this space that we live in. And that's exactly the same thing is true about Hashem. So you have to learn a little bit more about that, which is there's many things to discuss there. That's what Tselem Elokim means, for those who are familiar with that term. But ignoring that for now, that structure that makes us parallel to Hashem is what allows us to connect to Hashem. So you are inside of this, context where everything is essentially an expression of Hashem's very being, Hashem's self. The word being is the wrong word, Hashem's self. So if you think about that carefully, just as a baseline, beginning to sort of start shaking up your perspectives in a way that brings you somewhere a little bit more than where you were before, it's like a little bit meeting somebody. It's like, if you meet your spouse when you're dating, and it's like at first you just like you're into them, you like them, you like what's going on, and then one of them sort of and then they reveal something about themselves that's very profound, and you're like, wow, this person is like gigantic, like not physically gigantic, but just gigantic, like they're just experientially gigantic, like there's something about them that's like so beyond. And when you experience that, that's something that gives you like a broader like way of seeing them that now allows you to find more out about them than you had before. In other words, it starts you on a path of process and progress to deepen your connection with them. And that's what we're saying about Hashem also. I'm giving you this example as a way to sort of deepen and expand your capacity and your opportunities for more real, expanded interaction, connection with Hashem. So again, I didn't tell you enough yet about who Hashem really is, but this is like a step forward in that general direction to sort of illustrate the idea of the path you should take. There are many books that I could recommend, things to use, tools that are just very useful to help develop ideas about who Hashem is. But just for now, we're going to leave it at that point with this video. And so again, those are our 2 points. One is the clearing out the problems, which is basically becoming honest with yourself, admitting to yourself what you actually think and where you're holding with your own ideas, and then realizing that you are stagnating in those ideas to some degree, and how to sort of clean that out and then look for the next phase of ideas that you need to have to deepen your relationship with Hashem, the real Hashem, not just your random imagination, your habituated way of thinking about Hashem that has been there for whatever amount of time and that has not been renewed. But rather to try to actually get to a deeper, more real, and then increasingly more and more deep relationship, interaction with Hashem. And that is how you deal with the atheist problem. Because again, being an atheist is actually a great thing, because atheists are extremely smart. What they're doing is they're saying, I don't believe in this primitive level of understanding. It cannot be that this is all that there is. I have to just believe there's a guy in the sky and just have blind faith and just sort of, that's just what it is. Like, that's a very irrational and it's in every way different from every other way that we think in our lives. And they have a very valid point. It's 100% true. That is not at all what the Torah has been describing ever. We do not claim things like that. We do not say there's an invisible guy in the sky that you have to just believe in and you have to have blind faith in that. And if you don't, you're going to go to hell. It's not a Torah concept. There was never anything like that ever. So there are statements that are made that way all the time in other thought structures that people call religions, and so those types of contexts, people will definitely take ideas and warp them or make them more shallow and make claims like that. But that was never anything that we said. We do not teach those things. That is not a Torah approach. So it might be a Judaism approach today, because a lot of Judaism is borrowing from other thought structures, much more shallow ideas. But just for our purposes right now, so that is not something that we say. That's why atheism is a very healthy cleansing of more shallow ideas that then sets the stage for much deeper truths that are incredibly profound, super palpable, and like very, very real in our lives. So that's essentially, phase one of solving the problem. And we could put that all into the context of, we said in the previous video, there was like two different, I guess you can call them types of kavana. We didn't really just define what kavana means, but just for our purposes right now, the two different things you were supposed to be using in order to actually create the process of tefillah. One was knowing who you're talking to, that you're in a conversation with somebody, and the second one was understanding what it is that you're saying. So this video is really, on the first part, trying to sort of deepen a little bit the knowing who you're talking to and who the conversation is with. And in the next video, we're going to sort of sum it up with the understanding what you're saying, to understand a little more what exactly the siddur is and what it's for and where the flaws are, especially in today's understandings, and then how to use that more effectively as a very powerful tool once you know the ways to use it. So I hope that was relatively clear and that you enjoyed that, and looking forward to seeing you in the next video.